Hello students, we're going to go ahead and wrap up Unit 1.1, these notes, with our last topic, topic 4. In topic 4, we are going to do kind of a quick introduction to what's called organic chemistry, and some basic ideas about organic chemistry that are actually going to be that we're going to dive in a lot deeper on in the next set of notes in Unit 1.2. So that's what's going to happen in this video. So let's talk about what organic chemistry is and kind of where this is going to lead throughout the year. So we talked a lot about how living organisms are made mostly of water, right? We are filled with water. But if you took all the water out of living things and you're just left with like what is physically our bodies and our body tissue and the components that make up us and our cells, it's mostly carbon, like I explained before in topic 1. We are carbon-based organisms, and all of the molecules inside of us are all contain carbon. And so every single molecule basically that is used, that creates you and your cells and all cells on this planet, is made of carbon. And so organic molecules refers to these carbon-containing molecules that we find in living things. And so that's what an organic molecule is. It's a carbon-containing molecule that exists because of living things, and it's found in living things. So for the most part, organic compounds, these molecules, they fall into one of 4 categories or classes. There's carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. That basically most molecules that make up cells and living things, they fall into one of those categories. And we're going to talk about each of those in a huge amount of detail in the next set of notes. So be excited for that. But for now, just know that they exist, and we'll get into that. But let's talk real quick about the carbon atom and why it's so special for living things. A carbon atom has 4 valence electrons. So those are the electrons in the outer energy shell. And that, because carbon has 4 valence electrons, it allows carbon atoms to form 4 covalent bonds with other atoms. So carbon's always going to have 4 covalent bonds, always. Carbon will always find a way to make 4 covalent bonds with other atoms. And because of that, it allows carbon to create these very stable and large and extensive structures by binding to other carbon atoms and other elements. A lot of times you'll see in organic molecules a bunch of carbons bonded to other carbon atoms along with a bunch of hydrogens, and then some other elements that we kind of talked about before as well, like oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. Those elements that are commonly found in living things. But even if you guys look at these pictures, all of these pictures are showing you some some smaller organic molecules, which are pretty big. And in these images, hopefully you can see all these carbons bonded to each other. And carbon is always, you can look at any carbon in these pictures, and it's always going to have 4 bonds. Like if you look at this carbon right here, it's going to have a bond right here, a bond right here, a bond right here, and a bond right here. 4 bonds. Right? If you look at this carbon, it has a bond here, a single bond, but then it has a triple bond with this carbon. It's a total of 4 bonds. It's always going to be a total of 4 bonds. Or if you look at this ring structure here, benzene, this is a molecule called benzene, and this is a carbon bound to another carbon, and then the same carbon is double bonded to this carbon, and then a bond to this hydrogen. It's a total of 4 bonds. And so you're always going to see that. And that ability allows carbon to create, like I said, these very large chains of carbon atoms attached and bonded to also hydrogen atoms. And we call these long hydrocarbon chains, we call them hydrocarbons. So hydrocarbons refers to just these large molecules that contain a bunch of carbons and hydrogens all bonded together. And so these hydrocarbons, which are like the backbone of all organic molecules, these molecules that build our cells and build our bodies, these hydrocarbons can form a huge diversity of structures. A lot of times you'll see that they form these very extensive branching structures as well as ring structures, and these are just little snippets of some smaller organic molecules, but these organic molecules actually get very large on a molecular level. And so that's carbon. And so when we're visualizing these organic compounds, you should be, like I said, these molecules very quickly get very large and kind of exhausting to look at, especially when you're used to looking at smaller molecules like water. It's H2O, there's 3 atoms. Or even like glucose, which is like C6H12O6, 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. That's actually a really small organic molecule, believe it or not, even though it has a bunch of atoms, or 24 different atoms in that molecule. What we're about to talk about is how in these organic molecules, they actually get very, very large with lots of atoms. So here are some also what we would kind of consider small organic molecules that can kind of contain a lot of atoms. But in terms of visualizing them and showing the structure of these molecules, you guys should be a little bit familiar with Lewis structures. Probably not Lewis structures that are as big as this, but Lewis structures kind of show all the different bonds that exist between the atoms in the molecule and where all of those bonds are. And then there's also a lot of times you guys will see like these 3D models. They're called ball and stick models that kind of 3-dimensionally lay out what these molecules look like and how these atoms are bonded together. But probably the most often thing that you're going to see are what we call these summarized structures. Because these molecules get very large and they contain a bunch of carbons and hydrogens, scientists have found like a very efficient, easy, and lazy way to kind of draw out some of these structures, where they kind of basically don't show you all the carbons and hydrogens. And so instead, they have these stick structures, and every corner or endpoint of these sticks represents a carbon atom. So I know by looking at this, if you look at the bottom here, this there's a bunch of carbons and hydrogens that are not being displayed specifically in this structure, but I know that it exists there. Like I know right here there's a carbon, right here there's a carbon right here, there's a carbon here, there's a carbon here, a carbon, a carbon, a carbon, a carbon, a carbon. At all these different points, there's carbon atoms. And attached to those carbon atoms, what they're also not showing you is hydrogen atoms, because there's just so many. And basically, an organic chemist or a chemist can look at this structure and figure out the rest of it. Like this is all I need to know the whole Lewis structure. Basically, like I know there's a carbon atom right here, and this carbon atom is bonded to a carbon atom right here and a carbon atom over here. That's 2 bonds, and I know that the other 2 bonds that I don't see here are to hydrogen atoms. So I just know in my head that there's hydrogen atoms here not shown, along with carbon atoms at each of these endpoints. Which you can actually see, this structure right here is this picture, and this molecule, it's testosterone. Up here, and you can see right here where I was pointing, this carbon right here is this carbon right here, which like I said is bonded to a carbon and 2 hydrogens. And so just know, just what you guys need to know is when you look at pictures like this, you don't need to sit there and think about all the carbons and hydrogens. You just need to know when you see a bunch of zigzags and lines like this, that you're looking at, what you're not seeing is a bunch of carbons and hydrogens. They're just everywhere. So I look at this and I know this is a huge extensive structure of hydrocarbons, a bunch of carbons and hydrogens. That's all I want you guys to know when you look at pictures like this is just a bunch of carbons and hydrogens and carbons and hydrogens and carbons and hydrogens that you can't specifically see. And over here, here's an example with sucrose. This is the sugar that we use for baking, like the sugar you buy at a grocery store. This is what that molecule looks like, the Lewis structure. Here's a 3-dimensional model, and here's a summarized structure where it's not showing you all the different carbons in these rings, along with a lot of the hydrogens that they're attached to. So kind of get used to looking at these things at the bottom here. Now, in biology, in these organic molecules, these organic molecules all contain a hydrocarbon backbone, and so there's going to be this branching with ring structures, this extensive structure of carbons and hydrogens. Right now, attached to that backbone of hydrocarbons, you're going to see what's called functional groups. Functional groups are these clusters of specific atoms bonded to the carbon skeleton, that hydrocarbon skeleton, with special structures and chemical properties. And these functional groups ultimately become very important in determining how a molecule is going to behave and what kind of chemical properties that molecule has. And so this is really what's going to determine, like I said, the chemical reactivity and the polarity of these organic molecules, such as like how polar or nonpolar they are, if they have charged regions, if they're able to form, what kind of interactions they're able to form with other molecules. It really comes down to these functional groups. So here's a really easy example. This right here is a molecule called ethane, C2H6 right here. It's just a basic small hydrocarbon, right? 2 carbon, C2H6. That's this guy right here. This is actually a gas at room temperature, and it's explosive. It's a combustible gas, this organic molecule. Now, a functional group is like this right here. This is a really common one you guys will see. It's an O and an H attached to each other, and then this cluster of atoms is attached to the hydrocarbon, this carbon backbone. So let's say I take this hydrogen off and I replace it with this functional group, this special group of atoms called a hydroxyl group. Now I've just taken this organic molecule and I've now created a different organic molecule. This is called ethanol, and this is actually alcohol. This is the alcohol that's consumed in alcoholic beverages. It's a liquid at room temperature. It's very polar. It's very hydrophilic. It loves water, whereas this guy over here, this is hydrophobic. It does not like water, and it's all because of this functional group. It really changes the properties of this molecule. So here's another good example. This is testosterone and estrogen. I kind of showed you testosterone earlier. These are steroid hormones that are produced in different, in mammals, and including humans. These help with male and female development. And these molecules are actually very, very similar molecules, estrogen and testosterone. If you guys look here, they basically have almost the exact same hydrocarbon backbone, like the whole structure here, which again, remember, this is just a bunch of carbons and hydrogens, carbons and hydrogens, carbons and hydrogens that they're not showing you, but it's a very similar hydrocarbon backbone. But when you look carefully, there's actually 2 specific differences in their functional groups. And so testosterone has an oxygen here, double bonded to this hydrocarbon backbone. And at that same location in estrogen, instead of an oxygen, it's an OH group, a hydroxyl group like I showed you earlier, along with this extra, what we call a methyl group attached to testosterone. But really that's the only difference between these 2 molecules, which, as you guys know, these molecules have a huge difference in effect on the human body, right? Whether it's female reproductive development or male reproductive development. And that's all because of these functional groups. These functional groups become really important, like I was saying. And it's not so much the hydrocarbon, but it's these functional groups that really determine how these molecules are going to behave and what they're doing in your body. Another thing I want to point out is hydrocarbons, and I probably skipped through this earlier. Hydrocarbons by default are non-polar, and I need you guys to memorize that. I don't know if it's stated somewhere. It probably is. Maybe it's coming up, but write it down if it's not coming up. Hydrocarbons by themselves, whenever you just have a bunch of carbons and hydrogens, that's going to be by default non-polar. It's not going to have charged regions, and it's going to be hydrophobic, remember? So non-polar things are hydrophobic. And so whenever you have just a bunch of carbons and hydrogens, like this is a good example up here, there's just a bunch of carbons and hydrogens. Even right here, there's just a huge amount of carbons and hydrogens. Those are all very non-polar, hydrophobic things, okay? Whenever you just have a bunch of carbons and hydrogens bonded to each other. Now, when you add these functional groups a lot of times start changing that hydrophobicness or that non-polarness into something that's a little bit more polar or hydrophilic. These guys right here, they don't have a lot of functional groups attached to them. It's mostly just these hydrocarbons that they're not fully showing us. And so really these are actually non-polar molecules overall because of the huge extensive dominance of all these hydrocarbon regions, this backbone of hydrocarbons. Very non-polar, hydrophobic. Now, the functional groups that we're going to see in this class, there are 6 really common functional groups, these special groups of atoms that are attached to the hydrocarbon backbone. And so this table summarizes 3 of them, and then there's another 3 on this next slide. And you don't have to specifically memorize these, although it's kind of a lie because you'll kind of have to be able to identify these in the next set of notes, and I'll point that out later. But don't worry about like sitting down and memorizing this table. But there are 6 different really common ones that I just want to point out to you guys. This is a hydroxyl group. I kind of pointed out earlier. It's an O with an H attached to it. This is a carbonyl group. It's when you have an oxygen double bonded to a carbon. That actually was right here. This is a carbonyl group. This is a carboxyl group. It's when you have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and also to an OH. So it's kind of like this and this combined, the hydroxyl and carbonyl group, into one functional group right here. That's called a carboxyl group. So far though, look at the importance over here. You guys look, they're basically, these functional groups are usually polar. So this is polar, which means it's hydrophilic. This is polar, which means it's hydrophilic. This is polar, which means it's hydrophilic. And so maybe that's the most important thing right now, is you guys just to notice that these functional groups, you don't need to memorize them specifically right now, but you need to maybe just know when you see them, it's causing there to be less non-polarness and more polarness in these molecules. Here's another 6. This is an amino group. It's when you have a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens attached to it. That's called an amino group, polar. This is a sulfhydryl group with S and an H attached to the rest of this hydrocarbon. Again, that is, that's slightly polar, not as polar as some of these other ones. And then a phosphate group, another really common one we'll see, is this phosphorus with a bunch of oxygens attached to it. That's also polar. And so those are 6 very, very common ones. You don't need to memorize them specifically right now, but you're kind of going to have to memorize them in the future for specific things that you need to be able to identify. Don't worry about it yet. But just know when you see these special groups of atoms attached to these hydrocarbons that these, they're functional groups and they're a lot of times polar, okay? And so you actually have a question in your notes, which if I just skip to on the side of your notes, where they show you 3 organic molecules, and they want you to start trying to use the table in the notes in my slides and kind of see if you can start finding and labeling some of those functional groups that I pointed out. See if you can find some on here in those molecules. And so that's something you're going to do in your notes on the left side. Moving on here to a couple more things. So then we get into this idea of macromolecules, and this is going to be really important because the whole next set of notes is about this. So organic molecules that we find in living things, they oftentimes are forming these ginormous molecules, and that's why we call them macromolecules. Macro means huge. Molecules, like very, very large. Like I can't even, it's hard to fathom almost how big they are. Some of these molecules contain thousands and thousands, sometimes even millions of atoms, all bonded together in molecules. In a single molecule, you can have thousands and thousands and thousands or millions of atoms all covalently bonded together. They form huge molecules. And so, I mean, they're still on a molecular level, very small, but huge compared to like molecules like CO2 or H2O. These things are gigantic. And this is often what we find in living things. We find these gigantic, ginormous molecules that are being formed called macromolecules. Now, really, when you look at these macromolecules more carefully and you examine them, what you actually see, usually what we find is really they're just these gigantic molecules, but really they're just made up of these repeating subunits. It's these repeating pieces that are bonded to each other over and over and over and over and over again. That's what we basically are always going to see in these macromolecules. Now those repeating units, we call them monomers. And when they bind to each other over and over and over and over again, we call those polymers. So here's kind of like a simple illustration of that idea. Like a monomer is this sphere, and then you have a bunch of those spheres bonded together. That's a polymer. Here's kind of a real example of one. This is cellulose, I believe. This builds the cell wall in plant tissue or in plant cells. But anyway, this is a macromolecule. It's gigantic. This is just a snippet of it. This thing is huge. Imagine this times like 1,000. It just keeps going and going and going and going and going. But really, if you guys look, it's just a bunch of this piece right here bonding over and over and over and over again. So this is the monomer, and as it binds to itself over and over and over again, that's called the polymer. And that's gonna be the entire focus of our next set of notes in Unit 1.2. But that's basically what organic molecules oftentimes are. It's just these gigantic molecules that are made up of these repeating subunits called monomers, and when they bond to each other over and over and over again, we call that a polymer. This monomer, by the way, actually is glucose. So good old glucose, C6H12O6, that's him. And he's actually bonded to himself other glucoses over and over and over and over again to build this giant structure here, which is cellulose, which is ginormous, giant molecule. Now, these macromolecules, these giant molecules, you guys need to know two types of reactions that are either building these giant macromolecules, building these polymers made up of these repeating subunits, and then the reaction that causes them to break down into smaller pieces. So there's something called a dehydration synthesis reaction. This is a special type of chemical reaction that you need to memorize starting right now. And this is when monomers are joined together and bonded to one another to start building polymers, these giant macromolecules. So when you take a monomer and another monomer who weren't connected or bonded to each other, there's a special type of reaction called a dehydration reaction that forms a bond between those monomers, and now they're bonded together. And so this is a reaction that's leading to the building or the synthesis of these large polymers, these macromolecules. Now, in the process of that happening, it actually involves a water molecule being produced. So that's why we call it dehydration, because it's losing water as a result of this reaction. Water is being produced and going away, and that results in a bond that's forming between those monomers. So you need to memorize that. So memorize right now in your head, take a moment. A dehydration synthesis reaction is when monomers are being bonded together to build these larger polymers, macromolecules, and it results in water molecules being produced. You have to know that. Now there's another reaction that's literally the opposite of what I'm just saying. Watch this picture change. This is called a hydrolysis reaction, which does the exact opposite. In a hydrolysis reaction, we are taking monomers that are bonded together and we're breaking the bond between them and starting to separate monomers from one another. And so this allows large polymers to be broken down back into smaller pieces. That's what a hydrolysis reaction is doing. So it's breaking the bond between monomers, resulting in the degradation or the breaking down of large polymers back into individual monomers. Now this actually requires water molecules. So we're going to take those water molecules and we're going to actually use them to now break that bond. And for every bond you're breaking between monomers, it's going to require one water molecule. Just like every time you form a new bond between monomers, that's going to produce one single water molecule for every new bond that's made. And so you need to know the difference between the two, and you need to not mix it up. Okay, you'll see this come up very often in the near future. Dehydration reactions, hydrolysis reactions. Students often mix them up in their head, but take a little bit of time, 5 minutes or so today, to memorize the difference between them. And then the very last thing on here is just introducing you to the fact that these reactions, like these two types of very common reactions happening inside your guys' body, are controlled by ultimately are controlled and allowed to happen because of enzymes. And we're going to talk more about enzymes at the end of Unit 1. But there's these special molecules called enzymes that are actually required for cells to carry out all these chemical reactions. And so all the chemical reactions happening inside of your cells and inside of living things, including hydrolysis reactions and dehydration synthesis reactions, these are ultimately allowed to happen because of enzymes, which are going to act as catalysts to help speed up chemical reactions. That's what a catalyst is. So enzymes, like this gray blob right here, he's helping this chemical reaction take place in a way where it's going to go a lot faster and happen more efficiently in your guys' cells. And we'll talk a lot more about enzymes later at the end of Unit 1. But for now, that's kind of a quick introduction. Just have that in your mind. Anytime we talk about chemical reactions happening inside of living things or inside of cells or in your bodies, there's always enzymes involved helping those reactions take place. And then one other last thing I just wanted to say is that these two types of reactions, dehydration synthesis reactions and hydrolysis reactions, are super critical because in your body right now, this is happening literally all the time inside of cells all over the planet, inside of living organisms. Every single moment of the day, every second, these types of reactions need to happen. Where right now in your guys' cells, you are currently building new macromolecules. You're taking these monomers and putting them together to build large molecules that your body and your cells need. And you're also, at the same time, there's certain large molecules that your body and your cells are breaking down back into smaller pieces to then use those pieces to do other things with. And so both of these reactions are happening. Both of these types of reactions are happening in your body in a very balanced and necessary way. So just keep that in mind as well. Anyway, that is the very end of the Unit 1.1 notes. So we did it. We made it through all 4 topics. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you.